Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. On the show, I help yoga teachers make sense of the parts of teaching that often feel harder than expected, especially around anatomy and how to apply it to your cues and your sequences, and how to truly feel confident when you're teaching your classes. Here, you'll learn easy, practical ways to understand anatomy using my step-by-step blueprint and how to apply it directly to your cues and sequences so teaching feels clearer and more grounded, so you feel present and more confident. We'll also talk honestly about the inner side of teaching, things like self-doubt, growth, and what actually helps you feel confident over time. You can find daily videos and additional support over on my Instagram and my TikTok channels. On both those platforms, I'm at Bare Bones Yoga. All right, let's get into today's episode. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 398. I'm recording this actually on Monday, even though Monday is the day my new episodes drop. I did something over the weekend that inspired me for the next episode. And if you've been listening to the podcast recently, I am sort of in the middle of a series of episodes focused on different themes for your classes. I want to just take a quick break in that continuum to share this episode with you because I think it's an interesting one to sort of drop in the middle of that. And it also has kind of broad applicability to a lot of the themes that I've been talking about on the show here for a while. So here we are. I'm recording this on Monday, March 30th, 2026, and this will go live on April 6th. So what I did, sort of knowingly, but I wasn't sure kind of where it was going to lead, is I was listening recently over the weekend to an episode of the Huberman Lab podcast. And outwardly, it was about meditation. And so part of me was thinking, oh, let me take notes on this. Maybe there are some things for me personally, but also for yoga teachers in general that I can share on an upcoming episode that they can bring into their classes. And then, of course, you can go listen to the entire episode of Andrew Huberman's podcast for yourself. So I kind of went into it with that frame of mind. But in the listening to the episode, there were a number of things that really applied to teaching yoga. And I'm like a super nerd for catching these particular themes. Like I'm always looking for themes that I can share with you that will help you feel more confident, help you take some of the pressure off, help you feel more connected to purpose. I mean, I always sort of have my eyes and ears open for things like that. And so when I was listening to this episode and a couple of things like that came up, I said, okay, let me do a kind of, I don't want to say a special episode, but let me do a deeper dive into this on my show. So the whole idea here is, even though I'm going to start by just really briefly touching on some points that Andrew Huberman brought up on his show, and it's an interview with someone, which I'll tell you about in a second, we're going to sort of make it a broader theme. And the broader theme really has to do with this idea of, really, and I sort of hate to frame it in this way. One of the ways I can frame this conversation is to reveal to you a learning mistake that a lot of yoga teachers are making. And it's not really their fault. It's really sort of how the industry is set up. And I know I talk a lot about the industry here on my show, but I want you to appreciate that when you went and took your 200-hour training, and when you take any other training, you are participating in an industry-wide infrastructure that delivers training to you. And so from my perspective, from the 10,000-foot view, if there's something not right in that infrastructure, it affects not just you, but hundreds of thousands of yoga teachers all over the world. And a perfect example of this is the way 200-hour teacher trainings are provided. And again, I don't want to rehash a lot of what I've talked about from a critical perspective, but the reason I keep bringing this stuff up is because every time I talk to a yoga teacher who's struggling with this thing or some particular thing, they normally frame it as there's something wrong with me. I'm too old. I'm not smart enough. I can't learn anatomy. I don't have enough people in my classes, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of, I don't mean to say blah, blah, blah in a dismissive way, but the concerns that are shared with me are almost always framed from the point of view of the teacher feeling like there's something wrong with me. There's something I'm not getting. And many, many times I can tie it back to how a teacher was trained. But people don't oftentimes think of that. So the reason I keep harping on this is because I want you to start to see a distinction between you as a teacher and how you were trained and the product that's been created. I mean, yes, you are teaching in a way that infuses your authentic way of being, but a lot of how you're teaching has been influenced by who trained you, how they trained you, what was their understanding of anatomy, what is their teaching methodology, right? People don't go into teaching yoga as a knowledgeable person about how to do it. They go and they hitch their wagon to some other teacher, and they sort of are a sponge absorbing what that teacher is providing. And I mean, I hate to say it, but that's not always the best process. Not now with all we know about learning and neuroscience and best practices for learning. And to be quite honest, the yoga industry in many ways is sort of still in olden times when it comes to transferring knowledge to people. So I just wanted to kind of give you that disclaimer in a way, before I go into this particular episode. So when I say the learning mistake most yoga teachers make, that's a little disclaimer or a little more substantive explanation of why I'm choosing that title. So I want you to kind of start with this. Have you ever learned something in your training, like anatomy or sequencing, and you understood it intellectually, but when you go into the room to teach, it doesn't come out easily, right? You're not actually sure how to teach your sequence. You're not actually sure how to help somebody who's out of alignment, right? So I want you to just kind of think of that experience. If that's something that you can relate to, I want you to kind of think about it in the point of view of you learned something in your training and you understood it, but then when you go to teach, it doesn't come out clearly, right? So this is part of what came up for discussion when I was listening to the Huberman Lab podcast. And of course, he wasn't talking about teaching yoga, but that is, where I sort of made the distinction. So now that I've sort of set that up, um, let me kind of go into what I notated for the episode itself. And some of this will be kind of general application of meditation to life. But of course, we can provide this to our students as just fodder for conversation. But we're going to get into this learning framework piece in a moment. So I'm just going to share with you just some general things. And again, you can listen to, it's the episode, and you'll see it in the show notes from March 16th, 2026. And it's called Science-Based Meditation Tools to Improve Your Brain and Health. And Dr. Huberman interviewed Dr. Richard Davidson, who is a neuroscience, like Andrew is, and I'll include the link in my show notes. You can read all about his qualifications. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, and this is something that I've heard referenced in different podcasts, but it's finally starting to stick. And this is just a quick FYI about the brain, that there are brain waves that are always sort of going in our brain, but they're connected to our levels of awareness. And I didn't actually know this, but brain waves are measured in a unit called a hertz, Hertz, and it's abbreviated Hz, I believe. And one of the initial brain waves that are um, recorded are delta brain waves. And these are seen at levels of 1 to 4 hertz. And they're not seen in waking, they're seen in deep sleep. So if you wear a Whoop or you wear an Apple Watch to track your sleep, I don't think it actually tracks to this level of specificity, but it might be something that you could sort of download some sort of upgrade for. Theta activity is 5 to 7 hertz, and this is the transition from wakefulness to sleep. So when you're going to sleep, and it's also associated with certain kinds of meditation. Then there's alpha waves, which is 8 to 13 hertz, and that's when you're relaxed. You're awake, but you're relaxed. And then there's beta waves, which is 13 to 20 hertz. And this is activation if there is a cognitive task the person is doing, especially in the cortical regions of the brain. And these are the regions engaged in those tasks. So think about when you're teaching yoga, you probably are registering beta waves in your brain because you're doing a cognitive task. And then I don't want to say necessarily the highest level, but it is sort of described as peak level is gamma activity. And this is 40 hertz. This is seen during having insight, having an aha moment. It's a really short burst, 250 milliseconds, in long-term meditators have been seen to show this gamma activity. But in long-term meditators, what they found is that this gamma activity was going on for seconds and even minutes. But I was thinking about this in relationship to teaching yoga and thinking about the idea of when you're teaching your class, the more you feel confident, the more you know your sequence, the less you're thinking about what you're doing and more just being there and experiencing the class and being really present. You're potentially moving from some of those early stages, like these beta waves, where you're thinking a lot about what you're doing, to this more kind of unconscious competence stage of gamma activity. And when he was talking on the episode about gamma activity is seen, and when he says seen, he means doing brain scans. Gamma activity is seen when people are having some sort of insight, right? And think about when you're teaching your class and you get to the end, and I mean, this is certainly something that I've experienced when I'm looking out at the class and everybody's in Shavasana, and I just feel this deep connection to the present moment, to what I've done, to what I've just offered. And it really does feel like an epiphany to me. So I bet if my brain was hooked up, it would show gamma activity. And this is something you can think about too in retrospect when you get to the end of your week and you think about your classes. Do you feel like you were more in sort of beta activation where you were thinking really hard about what you were doing? Or do you feel like you were more balanced and, maybe even more in gamma activity where things felt really natural and coming to you just really without any effort? So then he goes on to talk about meditation and talking about these two, I don't want to say frameworks, but these two sort of states of being. And this also relates very much to teaching yoga. So he framed it as thinking, doing versus being, feeling, right? So again, think about when you're teaching. Do you feel like you're more in the thinking, doing realm, or are you more in the being, feeling realm? And I can sort of overlay, I've talked about this learning framework before, the framework of conscious incompetence, where you know what you don't know and you're thinking really hard to try to make up for gaps in your cueing and your understanding of anatomy and helping people with modifications and that sort of thing, versus you've done the work, you've learned anatomy, you've learned how to apply it to movement, and now you're not thinking so hard about that. It's just coming to you as you're looking out at the room, as people are moving on the mat. You're inspired to say, maybe a modification or something helpful to get somebody into better alignment. It's just coming to you naturally based on the work you've done to learn the concepts and how to apply them to your teaching. So that puts you more in the being feeling realm versus the thinking doing realm. So it's not like I'm doing the teaching, it's like I'm in being. And that again, this sort of state of being is, really sort of, I don't want to say a self-actualized way, but it's sort of like a higher level way of teaching where you're kind of transcending from thinking so hard about what you're doing to really just being there. Now, one of the other one of the other things he went into that I wanted to share with you, and this is a little bit more academic from a neuroscience standpoint, is he talked a lot about some studies he's done where he really just looked at the impact of 5 minutes a day of meditation on a group of people. And I wanted to just reiterate to you some of the benefits of meditation. Now, he's talking about it in the context of just 5 minutes a day. Certainly, if you do more, you probably have more benefits like this. But these are the kinds of things that we can bring up in our classes. We can reinforce through seated stillness we do in class, longer shavasanas, any sort of specific guided meditation we do in class. So I'll just briefly run down some of these benefits. So things like decreases in depression, decreases in anxiety, decreases in symptoms of stress, um, increase in feelings of well-being, decrease, this was an interesting one from a medical standpoint. Decrease in levels of inflammatory markers in the body. So these are things, if you want to be really science nerdy, these are things like interleukin 6 and pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are things that are in your blood. You can test for them with blood tests, and they are sort of red flags that your body is undergoing some sort of stress response or inflammatory reaction to something. And a lot of people live with high levels of IL-6 and cytokines in their blood. That's just their baseline. And so this obviously has broad implications for overall health. The other thing that was interesting is changes in the microbiome. So the microbiome is essentially the environment of your gut, right? Your stomach and your intestines, not just your stomach. And that is more and more, there's so much research coming out about, how the health of your gut microbiome affects your entire body, including your brain. So I don't want to get into all the science there, but the fact that meditation has a positive effect on your microbiome is amazing. And then, of course, changes in the brain. And we talked about brain waves. So that's just like a quick primer on benefits of meditation. And the one thing that he said, uh, Dr. Davidson said, was the best kind of meditation to do is the kind you do where it's easy to do it every day. He literally said the best kind to do is the kind of meditation you can do every day. And he was a big proponent of meditation that happens in motion. So not just seated meditation, but even like a really typical mindfulness activity like washing the dishes or doing the laundry or going for a walk. He was broadening the description of meditation to also include activities like that. The other thing that I wanted to share with you, and I'm just kind of looking through my notes here because I don't want to do like a full reiteration of the episode. That's not what my podcast is about, but more just the fact that I'm having this conversation with you being inspired by this Huberman Lab pod. So, this other big, broad concept that Dr. Davidson talked about is this concept he calls flourishing. And when you think about flourishing just as a person, right? When you're flourishing, I think in today times they refer to it as thriving, right? You're thriving, you're doing really well. And so I want you to think of flourishing like that. And he provided 4 pillars of flourishing. And he talked about things like number 1, awareness, number 2, connection, number 3, insight, and number 4, purpose. And he was talking about it in the context of with, more consistency around your meditation, you will, be forming the fertile ground to flourish in your life, right? As a human. And he was also talking about flourishing in the context of neuroplasticity, which is defined as the brain's the brain's ability to change in response to stimuli, in response to experience. And it doesn't matter what your age is, your brain always has a neuroplastic ability. It's a little bit more challenging to access that as we get older, but you still can change your brain in positive ways. You can still learn new things, doesn't matter how, what your age is. And so when he talks about the four pillars of flourishing and each thing exhibiting neuroplasticity, and he talks about awareness, for instance, he's talking about mindfulness, sort of this awareness of yourself. When he talks about connection, he's talking about relationships with other people. When he talks about insight, he's talking about, kind of having a curiosity about the kind of person you are and how you're doing in life. And then when he talks about purpose, he's talking about how can we find purpose in the day to day, not just the big goals that we have, throughout the year. But when I look at these four pillars of flourishing, I actually was thinking about you as a yoga teacher. So again, he defines them as awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. So I want you to now frame it as in the context of you as a teacher. So, when you're teaching your classes, do you have a level of awareness around how you're doing? Are you doing something on a weekly basis to check in with yourself, to build your awareness of how do I feel when I'm teaching my classes? And then this second pillar, connection, this idea of connection in the context of what he's talking about is relationships with other people. But when we go into the room and we're teaching our classes, there's a connection there we're building with other people. So that's how it relates in part to teaching. And then the idea of insight. He talks about, being curious about how you're doing in life. And when we're talking about awareness, bringing insight to our teaching, that is such an important skill because otherwise we're just sort of going through the motions without actually noticing what is working here. How am I feeling? I mean, so much of the conversation we have with, or so much of the conversation had with teachers is how are your students feeling? What kind of feedback did you get? I mean, the whole concept of feedback is based on getting somebody else's opinion about how you taught instead of what kind of insight do I have for how I taught? How do I feel about the class I just taught? And then this whole conversation about purpose really gets into, do you feel connected to a purpose when you're teaching? And what is that? It's usually something that teachers really feel before they sign up for their 200 hour, and then they get so bogged down with all the details. They lose sight of why did I even start teaching in the first place? Most of the time that I have conversations with teachers, they've sort of strayed from that. And that can really be, a source of feeling disconnected and feeling like it's work rather than feeling like it's something that I get to do. Now, that really brings us to the part of the podcast where Dr. Huberman and Dr. Davidson talked about something. Actually, Dr. Davidson brought it up, and it's pretty far into the conversation. So if you do listen to the episode, it's pretty far in. And Andrew does a great job with show notes, so you can just scroll down. And you're going to get to this concept I'm going to talk to you about now, which is two forms of learning. And I am like such a big nerd for this kind of thing because my focus is like on helping people learn, whether it's teaching classes, helping them learn yoga. But these days, it's really primarily helping people learn how to apply anatomy to teaching, how to apply movement to teaching. And so I am just a sponge for anything that has to do with learning. How do people learn? What are the best ways for people to learn? Because that's the way I want to teach my stuff. And this is why when I was saying to you before about the yoga industry training teachers is sort of back in, they're sort of still in the olden days of how people learn. inundating people with information and then expecting them to just go in the class and magically implement it. So he talks about these two forms of learning: declarative learning and procedural learning. And I want to just say right off the gate, it's not an either or. You need both of these kinds of learning. Both of these kinds of learning. One can't exist without the other. Now, in my world or in my vernacular, I refer to it as building knowledge and applying knowledge. But I want to go into this a little bit more because when I heard Dr. Davidson talk about these two points of reference, I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what I've been talking about for years. I just hadn't named it in the way neuroscientists do. So he talks about declarative learning as learning about things, and he calls this conceptual learning. And then he talks about procedural learning, which is skill-based. It's skill-based learning acquired through practice. And it literally uses different brain networks than declarative learning. So this whole idea, when I started out this conversation by asking you, can you relate to learning something in your training, like anatomy or sequencing, and understanding it, but then when you go to teach it, it doesn't come out clearly? This is exactly what I'm talking about. So this idea of declarative versus procedural learning. So this is really the core of the conversation today. Most yoga teacher trainings focus heavily on declarative learning. So this is your read this book, even read this book before you get to teacher training. So here's some homework before you even get there, which I don't really subscribe to that, but hey, more power to you if that's something that you had to do. I mean, it's not bad or wrong. It's just, I don't know why we would burden people with, here, do all this learning on your own and then come to my training. Like, I take that on myself to be the teacher, not to give people pre-homework before they get there. Anyway, so this is the reading of the books. This is the watching the slideshows. This is the rules around how to do poses, or this is the, rules around how to do sequencing. Like the rules is framed as do it this way because this is the right way to do it. And I've talked about this on other episodes, the distinction between teaching method and, sort of, information that's grounded in anatomy. Teaching method can go any way it wants, even if it goes against fundamental movement principles. And people can always say, well, this is just how I was trained. This is just how my teacher does it. But that's okay. But just call it for what it is. It's teaching method. It's not necessarily grounded in anatomy. And again, there's nothing bad or wrong with any of this stuff. We need to sometimes see muscles in slideshows. We need to sometimes read a book. We need to sometimes reference somebody's teaching method. It's just that it can't be the only piece. And this is what I mean when I talk about building knowledge versus applying knowledge. So when you get to procedural learning, we're talking about things like how to cue in real time, how to adjust people based on what you see, how to build a sequence logically and really understand the anatomy behind it, how to see someone who's out of alignment and know how to help them, how to share cues with a framework that demonstrates that you actually know what you're talking about. Like these are the true application pieces that must be in place along with the declarative learning, the building of the knowledge. Otherwise, the teacher is always going to feel that gap. So things like you might know what the hamstrings do, but can you cue a student clearly in downward dog so that you're actually speaking to what the hamstrings are doing in that pose, and at the same time allowing people to experience it on a somatic level, however they're experiencing it? Because a lot of times when teachers get the declarative learning piece down, but not the application piece or not the procedural learning piece down, they'll say things like, okay, in downward facing dog, you should feel your hamstrings lengthen here. And see, that leaves a big gap for anybody in your class who doesn't feel lengthening happening. And that highlights a big gap in the teacher, that the teacher doesn't realize that on a somatic level, some people aren't going to feel length. And furthermore, some people are not going to have really tight hamstrings. There are some people walking around that don't have overly tight hamstrings.
And all you have to do is look at their pelvic positioning to get a clue as to what's going on with their hamstrings, because the hamstrings start on the ischial tuberosities, which are the sitting bones, which are on the pelvis. So this whole idea, if you feel like you understand things but you can't apply them when you teach, it's not because something is wrong with you. It's because you were taught more in this declarative way, this way of building knowledge. I mean, a perfect sort of illustration of this is when teachers say, "Oh my God, my brain is so full," after a day of being in training, or "Oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed. Oh my God, I can't even keep my eyes open." Right? So there's that whole experience of just getting overloaded with information. So what actually builds skills is this idea of leaning into procedural learning. So this comes up through having frameworks for your cues and your sequences. This is a big part of what I teach. Repeating using these frameworks in real life situations so you can make them your own. Things like having a signature sequence and going out there and using it over and over again and learning from your own experiences of using that signature sequence, both in terms of how you feel when you teach it and, you know, how not just how you feel, but your ability to think less about it when you're teaching it. Things like when you're looking at people who are out of alignment, do you have a sense of what to share with them? Do you know the cues to say that are going to get them into better alignment? So these are things that highlight signature use of a signature sequence, applying anatomy to your teaching, and having a framework for your cues that allows you to move away from the script and move more into speaking to what's actually happening right in front of you. This is the what I often say the cue and see what they do. So if this is something you're experiencing, maybe you can relate to this in terms of how you were trained, and you can relate to this feeling of disconnect when you're teaching. If this is something you're experiencing, feel free to reach out. I am always happy to help you think through how to apply what you already know and also how to fill in some of the gaps of what might have been missing. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I'll include in the show notes a link to my signature sequence training video, so you can pick that up. And then also a link to Andrew's episode if you want to take a deeper dive into this subject by listening to that. I hope you found this interesting. It might be a little nerdy, but I hope that you found some value in this. And as always, I open it up to any thoughts you want to share with me. The best way to do that is just drop me a little note on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening to the end, and I'll chat with you next time on Conversations for Yoga Teachers. Namaste. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If anything we talked about resonated with you, especially around anatomy, cueing, or feeling more confident when you teach, I want you to know that you are not alone. A lot of teachers tell me these are definitely challenges for them. As a thank you for being a podcast listener, I'm offering you $50 off my 4-week Yoga Anatomy Accelerator program. It's a short, focused program designed to help yoga teachers learn anatomy in an easy step-by-step way and how to apply it directly to their teaching. To get the podcast listener discount, you can head over to my Instagram and just send me a DM with the words podcast offer. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.